In some ways, I'd rather have been here talking about beer and food, but there we go. I've been asked to talk about responsible tourism, sense of place, and local economic development, all in half an hour. The first thing I wanted to raise with you, though, is what is tourism? Because a lot of people see tourism really as just people staying in hotels or campsites. But we should remember that it also includes people who come to stay with friends and relatives. A very common occurrence, particularly during food festivals, is that people's families come to stay. And of course, it may be people staying in the next town. It may be people coming from Brighton or from Ashford who come here to experience the day. For the businesses and the attractions, apart from the accommodation providers, it makes little difference whether they're day visitors, tourists, or locals. They're all spending money in the local economy. And I think what we mean here, really, in terms of this conference, is the visitor economy and getting people to spend money in Hastings or wherever you're from. And that's really about seeing the tourist, the visitor, as additional local demand. It's that opportunity to take money from more people, and I want to come back to that aspect. Visit England launched a campaign in 2009-10, which was Enjoy Every Moment. And what was impressive about this campaign was it addressed the local person, the person who commuted to work in a town, children in local schools, domestic tourists, international visitors, with the same campaign. Now, sadly, they only ran it for 1 year. It's the characteristics of marketing tourism that campaigns change very quickly. But what was important about this was it made the point that every tourism facility is available to local people if they can afford it. There's always an issue about who can afford the tourism experience and who can't. Sustainable and responsible tourism are not the same thing. Sustainable tourism is often just an abstract idea, one that isn't operational, that people are not doing anything to achieve. To call it responsible tourism, people have to take the individual and group responsibility to make sustainable development happen through tourism. And actually, there's very little of it. There's a lot of talk about sustainability. There's very little taking of action or exercising of responsibility. So what is it? It's a triple bottom line: economic, social, and environmental approach to managing tourism. For the traveller, it's a way of travelling. It's become a bit of a movement in the sense that a lot of different people are engaged with it. It's diverse, and I think that's clear within the groups of people represented here today. It means different things in different cultures, different places, and for different organisations. And it has to be characterised by transparency. People need to talk openly about what they're doing to make a difference. And I think that film was a brilliant example of the way in which people can talk about what they're doing and be very entertaining in the process of doing that. But overwhelmingly, it requires people's willingness to accept responsibility and being willing to take action, to do things to make the world a better place. The Cape Town Declaration in 2002, which I was part of drafting, is not perhaps unusual in that it starts with minimising negative impacts, whether they're environmental, social, cultural. It talks about maximising the positive economic benefits. I think where it's a bit different is it talks about involving local people in decision making, the third thing in that list. Strong emphasis on participation and partnership and engaging everyone in making those critical decisions about what kind of tourism will take place in a particular place. It also talks about making a positive contribution to the conservation of natural and cultural heritage. And for me, particularly as president of the Timothy Taylor Appreciation Society, that appreciation and commitment to the conservation of some of those great foods and drinks is a critical part of responsible tourism. The fifth thing here is about the tourist experience. It's about saying that you have to provide enjoyable experiences for tourists which create meaningful connections, which help them to understand and share with local people the local cultural and environmental issues which lie behind the way we produce our food. We need to make sure it provides access for everyone, and we have to ensure, and this for me is a critical value of responsible tourism, that it's culturally sensitive and that it's based upon respect. That it's an opportunity to share between different peoples from different places in the appreciation of food and drink, or of language, or of poetry, or of photography. But it's about sharing, being culturally sensitive, and sharing with respect. Responsible tourism is not a brand or a product range. Ecotourism can be responsible. In fact, more often than not, it isn't. Community-based tourism can be responsible. Very often, it isn't. All-inclusive holidays can be responsible. In other words, all forms of tourism can be more or less responsible. And the challenge in a place like Hastings is try to make all the kinds of tourism that happen here more responsible. This is the graphic which was used in 2002 at the conference which passed the Cape Town Declaration. And you can see that it places the idea of taking and exercising responsibility there in the context of the principle of sustainability and the UN World Tourism Organization's Global Code of Ethics. You can see across the bottom the different stakeholders who need to be involved, from the tourists, the travellers and the holidaymakers, through the local community, government, the tourism businesses and the tour operators. The difficulty is, and any of you who've been involved with trying to reorganise tourism or to change the shape of tourism anywhere, is that it is everybody's responsibility. And you can't do it if only one of those groups is active. Government cannot do it on its own. The local community cannot do it on their own. It needs to be a combination, a partnership between a lot of different players coming together to make the change. This is the UNWTO's definition of sustainable development of tourism. They say it's applicable to all forms of tourism. They talk about the optimal use of environmental resources, about respect, and about providing social economic benefits, interestingly, to all stakeholders. This notion that all of the people involved in tourism should benefit, whether they're tourists, the local community, or the tourism businesses. But the reason I wanted to share this with you is the 4 points which end that definition. It's a continuous process. It needs informed participation by all the stakeholders, and I think that notion of informed participation, so that people know what's going on and contribute to it. Strong political leadership, which is where I think the role of local government and the role of projects like this play an important part. And if we don't satisfy the tourist, it won't work. We have to be able to give the tourist a good experience that they'll talk about. And those references to social media at the end of the last film seem to me to be very important, because social media is just a way of amplifying gossip. Yeah, those personal recommendations that people used to make in a very limited way are now amplified by social media. If your town has a good reputation, it's amplified. If your town has a bad reputation, it's amplified by social media. So it's both an asset and a liability. So, to be successful, you have to be able to offer the visitor something which is unique, something which gives you a competitive advantage, something which others in the same region or in the same part of the world don't have. And that's very often about this mysterious thing called a sense of place. It's really what makes one place different from another. It's that sense of there being an identity. And the town we're in, forgive me if I raise the issue, but the town we're in, it seems to me, to has many different senses of place for many different people. It's clearly a place in which you can come and see fishermen still working, and that's rare on this coast. Makes it very different. You can see the history of fishing beautifully presented in the Fisherman's Museum. You can taste some wonderful fish, but you can also find the amusement arcades. and the drinking on the beach, and some of those other characteristics which people use the seaside for. And all places, in a way, have a number of different senses of place. What's interesting about tourism is it tends to pick out and amplify one or two of those senses of place. And that's where the role of government, local government, and of business organisations in determining how a place will be promoted plays an important role. What's driving change at the moment, I think, is that the consumer is looking for a richer engagement with destinations. No longer does the tourist just want to come and sit on the beach. They do want to do that, but they also want to engage with the communities who live here and to have a stronger sense of what the place is about. And that fits with broader consumer trends amongst consumers. So we get the commitment to wanting organic, fresh, locally produced goods and services, particularly relevant, I think, in the food sector. But we also get more emphasis now on what local communities want from tourism, seeing more influence being expressed by local communities about the way they'd like tourism to develop in their place. This is the event which Tim missed in Faversham Saturday evening. First time it's happened, first event in 2014. None of us knew how this would go. And in fact, all the food producers sold out. I think people were expecting 500 or 600 people to turn up. We think about 1,800 people turned up. Many of them from Faversham, but some had invited their friends to come along and share it. There's absolutely no doubt that this Midsummer Eve food event being run by Best of Faversham will happen every year. It's established. Within 2 or 3 years, people will assume it's always been there. It's a new tradition. And that's a tradition based upon primarily agricultural food. We have a small fishing community based out of Faversham, but it's very small. It's mainly around strawberries and fruit and meat and vegetables, and the cooking of them in interesting ways, including ethnic foods being produced with local fruit and vegetables. To come back to responsible tourism, which is about making better places for people to live in and better places for people to visit, but it's about where people live, first of all. It's about making better places for people to live in. Now, these images are from South Africa. In fact, they're from Cape Town, because that's where the declaration originated. But the same principles apply everywhere. It's about saying that, first of all, tourism is about making a better place for people to live, because better places for people to live are better places for people to visit. All forms of tourism then can be more responsible. In economic terms, that means employment and local economic benefits, normally through economic linkages, and local sourcing, particularly of fruit, vegetables, farm products, and fish, is critical to ensuring that the local benefit is maximised. I'll come back to that towards the end. But it's also about recognising the social benefits of stopping urban drift, of encouraging young people to stay in rural areas, of maintaining heritage, of creating thriving destinations, and avoiding the displacement of ordinary commercial activity by tourism. I'll come back to that too. It's about environmental focus on the local priorities, of maintaining a green environment, of looking after the water supply, if that's an issue, and of course everywhere worrying about carbon. But it's also about engaging guests in these issues, of helping them to understand the economic, social and environmental issues, and about why Hastings or Faversham or Leuven are the way they are. It's about trying to help people understand that places are special, and by doing that, enhancing the guest experience and encouraging them to encourage others to come and visit. So the market opportunity, I think, is around offering a richer, more meaningful experience. And food and culture, the culture of food, locally sourced food, is critical to that. One of the facts of tourism, which cannot be avoided, is that we take our holidays in other people's homes. So last night I was a temporary resident in Hastings, stayed in a nice hotel. I bought a meal, I drank some beer, and today I've been to the fishmonger and will take some fish home with me. But I've made no real contribution to the cost of clearing up any litter. Now, as it happens, I haven't dropped any litter. But a lot of tourists in Hastings yesterday were dropping litter all over the beach. It's all been cleared up this morning, but that has to be paid for. It's also true that for me, one of the most attractive features of visiting Hastings was to see the fishermen and where the fishermen work. And those boats, fishing nets on the beach, those fishermen get no benefit from the tourists who wander around taking photographs of their fishing boats. They make nothing from the tourists. So the fundamental question for me in Hastings would be, does fishing use tourism or does tourism use fishing? And I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that it's the right question to ask for the fishermen. That question applies everywhere. This was Sir Colin Marshall when he was chairman of British Airways in 1994, when he said that tourism and the travel industry is the bit in black. It's essentially the renting out for short-term lets of other people's environments. So I came to Hastings partly because I was speaking at the conference, but I might have come to Hastings as a tourist. If I had come to Hastings just as a straight tourist, I'd have come because I wanted to share a bit of Hastings. But I wouldn't have paid any tax. I'd have made no contribution to Hastings other than some money paid to private entrepreneurs. I am a freeloader as a tourist. And that's a real problem for communities who have large numbers of tourists, is about how you pay for the cost of cleaning up after the tourist. The question for all of us, I think, when we think about tourism, is to think hard about who benefits. So to come on to sense of place. Hastings is clearly one place in the sense that it shares a grid reference, shares a particular piece of landscape. This is the official 1066 country image of Hastings. Here are a whole lot of images of Hastings. Some of them not very attractive, if I might say so. I don't think the one in the top left is a particularly attractive image of Hastings. I don't think it would attract me to come and visit. The one in the middle there with the Robert Tressel, who wrote The Ragged-Trousered Philanthropists, for a whole generation, a very important book. And at one point, Hastings used that as part of its promotion. It doesn't currently, as far as I can see. So the images of destinations change over time. It's defined essentially, I think, a place is defined by the interaction between the people who live and visit there. And each person who comes to Hastings will go away with an image of the place, and it won't all be the same image. People go away with different images. It'll be the things which they remember of the place. And of course, local people who live here and people who visit very often may have a very different image from the Chinese tourists that I saw in the Fisherman's Museum, who I don't think were getting very much from their visit other than being photographed in the museum, because they didn't have any of the language and there was no guide. They were just having a good time, as it happens in the Fisherman's Museum, partly because it's free, I think. But it's also shaped by the land and the people who live here and the way that the habitat has been shaped, and that's very clear with the castle and the beach. So here's TripAdvisor's view of Hastings, or the people who use TripAdvisor. It's a bit out of date, the pier's not there now. But this interested me. These are the top three. Old Town Hastings, the Fisherman's Museum is number 2 of 42 attractions in Hastings, free, been running since 1956. But then the third one is Battle Zone Live, which is certainly not part of my image of Hastings. In fact, I didn't even know it was here. Hastings Museum in at number 11, the Stade in at number 12, and where we are here is St Mary in the Castle in at number 13. Very interesting way of looking at the way different groups value the destination. Here's part of the cost, though. Now, the black plastic sack must be some local business getting rid of their rubbish without having to pay for it. And how can you leave litter so close to the bin like that? But somebody's had to come along and be paid to pick that up. RX Fisheries, this is actually where I bought my fish to take home tonight. This is a local fish outlet selling some local fish, but quite a lot of it, he admits, imported. There's no cod quota here at the moment. You were right about that, Tim. The cods had to be brought in from somewhere else. Here's two very different perspectives. This is a much smaller fishmonger, wet fish, with the carbon footprint, and next to it, on the right there, the catch of the day in a local restaurant. The one is a local fisherman making additional money by selling his fish. The one on the right is a restaurant benefiting from the fact that they're purchasing the fish locally, but not, they're buying it, but they're not actually fishing it out of the sea. But this is the kind of thing that you need to think about, I think. These are all photographs taken within the last 18 hours in Hastings. You could see that quite a lot of people were opposed to the creation of the Jerwood Gallery. And they're very ostentatiously, they're very proud of the fact that their slogans are still up. And then we have the Rock project, the regeneration project, creating a cocktail bar, a 28-bed hotel, luxury penthouses, a very upmarket product. It's going to be right in the Fisherman's Quarter. And almost certainly the residents of that new development will be objecting to the smell and the noise and the industrial activity which is going to go on the beach. And that's a recipe for conflict down the line. Now, if I pick that out and speak about it with some passion, it's because that's the battle that we're currently having in Faversham right now, with people wanting to bring in housing and close down what small amount of industrial activity still exists on our tidal creek. Those conflicts are at the heart of how land is used, the productive purposes that the land is used for, and tourism often exacerbates those conflicts. In terms of destinations, responsible tourism is about making better places for people to live in and better places for people to visit. And to do that, you need to get agreement about what the issues are, whether it's carbon, employment, local economic development. Then, and this is where the political leadership comes in, you have to get agreement about how to address the issue and what are the priorities which matter to local people. Very easy to say that. What are the priorities which matter to local people? But any politician, any project leader who's ever tried to do this will tell you that different people want different things. And getting a shared vision of what tourism might look like in any place is difficult. It's particularly difficult if the visions that people have are in conflict with each other. And luxury accommodation and working fishing is a classic example of one that leads to conflicts. So trying to find things which will work where there aren't conflicts between the different uses is a critical part of it. And then, of course, you need to be able to measure and report the progress that's made in increasing local economic benefits from tourism. But I thought it might be useful just to think for a minute about what local economic development means for tourism. And essentially, I think these are the main ways in which gross value is added to a local economy through tourism, the ways in which you get yield. Clearly, the people who rent out accommodation get an income from that and create employment, but the income is primarily one of rents. People rent a room or a campsite space. Then there are user fees, mainly charged by attractions, where you pay something to visit the attraction, go windsurfing, do crazy golf, whatever it is, but essentially you're paying a fee to use something, normally something which is private. So the country park, for example, which many people come to Hastings to use, nobody pays for that. It's free. Then there's the creation of employment. Then there's retail, all the shops which make a margin, commission, out of retailing goods which may or may not have been sourced locally in Hastings. And one of the things that's extraordinary to me is the way people at the airport can get back the VAT that they paid on goods that they purchase. So they go to the airport and they pay back the only tax that they've effectively paid while they've been in the country. All those VAT refunds that go on. I find that extraordinary. But the bit that really matters, I think, for this project, for these projects, is the local sourcing, the things which are sold to tourists and to tourism businesses which are produced locally. The food and the fish, particularly in the context of this project. And where the fishermen are able to sell those fish directly to the end consumer and get a retail price rather than a wholesale price, clearly that fisherman has made more money out of their catch. And that opportunity to sell to tourists is a great opportunity. Unless the consequence of that is that local people can no longer afford to purchase the product. Now, the classic example of that problem is oysters, which used to be a food eaten mainly by the poor working class of the East End of London. They're no longer sold in the East End of London because they become a premium product. Good for the fishermen, nonetheless. So, it's about taking responsibility, which means defining your priorities, picking issues which are local and where tourism can make a difference, determining who is responsible for what, thinking about unintended consequences, like what happens if you build high-quality accommodation right next to a working fish yard, set targets and measure impacts. One of the things that was said by the managing director of Shearings, which is a big British coach operation, big UK-based tour operator, he said to my students when he came to speak to them, responsibility is free. You can take as much of it as you can handle. Nobody's going to charge you anything to take as much responsibility as you want to handle. But of course, taking responsibility is expensive in terms of emotion, time, and effort. Others, of course, can undermine what you're trying to do. And for that reason, there's a role for government and regulation to control the free riders and to police various kinds of behaviour, including dropping litter, and to make that an expensive thing to do if you get caught through fines. But the critical thing is to take responsibility and to act. So the challenge, I think, is to use tourism to achieve sustainable development through tourism. The aspiration of responsible tourism, and I commend it to you for this reason, is to use tourism rather than to be used by it. The Midsummer Fish Fest is, I think, an example of this. I hope that it will grow and prosper. I suspect that it will. I gather from talking to people in the town that it was a big success yesterday. I hope to be back to it next year. Thanks for listening.